The Caruso estate hadn't seen chaos like this in 36 years. 24 of the world's most decorated physicians were crammed into a nursery that cost more than most people's homes. White coats blurring beneath Venetian chandeliers. Heart monitors screamed. Ventilators hissed. A team from Mayo Clinic barked orders at specialists flown in from Zurich, while a Nobel laureate in pediatric toxicology pressed his stethoscope to a tiny chest and whispered what no one wanted to hear. "We're losing him." Baby Nico Caruso, 8 months old, sole heir to an empire of pharmaceutical patents, waterfront real estate, and the kind of power that never showed up on a tax return, was dying. $50,000 an hour in medical expertise, and not a single soul could explain why his body had turned the color of a bruised evening sky. Blue lips, blue fingertips, a mottled rash creeping across his chest like a silent accusation. Every test came back inconclusive. Every treatment failed. His father stood 3 feet from the crib, fists clenched white. Emilio Caruso, the name that could empty a courtroom or shut down a city block. And right now he looked like exactly what he was. A father watching his only child die and unable to do a damn thing about it. And through the servant's entrance, pressing her face against glass that had never been cleaned for someone like her, stood a girl the world had taught to be invisible. Willa Mercer, 10 years old, daughter of the night shift maid. Wearing her mother's oversized coat because she didn't own one that fit, shoes so worn the pavement bit through every time it rained. She'd spent her entire life on the edges of this estate, the girl who noticed everything because nobody ever noticed her. She knew every camera blind spot, every unlocked door during the 3 o'clock shift change, every shadow safe enough to breathe in. Right now her hands were trembling because she was staring at something 24 geniuses had walked past without a second glance. The potted plant on the nursery windowsill. The one that arrived 3 days ago. The one that left an oily yellow residue on the gardener's gloves. Gloves that touched the baby's crib railing during yesterday's wipe down. Her great-grandmother, Dorothy Harlan, who'd healed half of Appalachia's poorest hollow with nothing but herbs and hands that smelled like lavender and wood smoke, had taught her to recognize that leaf before she could write her own name. Oleander. Every petal, every stem, every drop of sap, pure poison, beautiful enough to gift, deadly enough to kill an infant without leaving a trace. Modern medicine knew how to find. The doctors were about to crack open that baby's chest, looking for answers. The answer was sitting in a ceramic pot, wrapped with a satin bow. Willa looked at the window, then at the armed guard making rounds, then at her mother's face through the kitchen door. Jolene Mercer, 29, a woman who'd survived a husband who used her face as a punching bag, and a world that treated her like furniture. The woman who told her 1,000 times, "Stay invisible. Stay safe. Don't give them a reason to throw us out." Willa thought about what would happen if she was wrong. Out on the street by morning, her mother fired, blacklisted, a Connecticut winter closing in with nowhere to go. Then she thought about what would happen if she was right and did nothing. Her great-grandmother's voice hit her like a church bell. "When you know how to save a life and you don't, child, you ain't no different from the one who took it." Willa pulled her mother's coat tight, took one breath that burned all the way down, and ran. What would you risk to save a life the whole world says isn't yours to save? If this story already has its hooks in you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because this little girl just ran straight into a world of power, blood, and secrets, and nothing on the Caruso estate will ever be the same. Jolene Mercer learned how to become invisible long before she ever set foot in the Caruso estate. She grew up in a narrow valley deep in Appalachia, a place the maps forgot to name and the phone lines never bothered to reach, in a crooked wooden house wedged between 2 bare hills, where winter winds cut straight through the walls, as if the walls didn't exist at all. Her mother left when Joe was 5, leaving behind nothing but a pair of fake silver earrings and the smell of cheap perfume lingering on a pillow for a few days before it faded too. Joe never knew her father, never saw his face, never heard anyone speak his name, and she never asked, because she understood that some questions carry wounds inside the answers themselves. The woman who raised her was her grandmother, Dorothy Harlan, a small framed woman with rough hands that always smelled of lavender and burnt wood, the woman the entire valley called Dot and turned to whenever someone fell sick without money for a doctor, whenever someone was bitten by a snake or burned with fever in the middle of the night, while the nearest hospital sat 3 hours away down dirt roads. Dot healed with herbs, with remedies passed through 4 generations of women, with her hands and her faith, and the patience of someone who had seen too much suffering to still be afraid of it. She taught Jo the names of leaves before Jo could properly read or write. Taught her to tell a healing plant from a deadly one by the feel of a leaf and the scent of its sap. Taught her that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away, even if they took everything else. Jo loved her with the absolute love only abandoned children know how to give to the one person who didn't abandon them. Then Jo turned 18, and Bryce Mercer arrived. He came to the valley to work for a logging company. Tall, blue-eyed, easy smile, full of promises about a different life. A life with streetlights and grocery stores and a future. Dot looked at him with the eyes of someone who had known too many kinds of poison and told Jo, "There are plants so beautiful you want to bring them into your home, but touch them and your skin blisters. Remember that." Jo remembered, but Jo was 18, and at 18 everyone thinks they're different. Everyone thinks they'll be the exception. She followed Bryce to a small town 4 hours away. The first 6 months he was gentle. In the 7th month he hit her for the first time, a slap after dinner because the food was too salty. And then he held her and cried and begged forgiveness. And Jo believed him because Jo wanted to believe, and because Jo had no one else left to believe in. By the 10th month, the beatings no longer needed reasons. Bryce hit her drunk, hit her sober, hit her when Jo spoke, and hit her when Jo stayed silent. She hid bruises under long sleeves in the middle of summer, and told the neighbors she'd fallen down the stairs even though their apartment was on the ground floor. When Jo discovered she was pregnant, she thought the baby would change everything. Bryce stared at the test with its 2 lines, said nothing, took all the cash from the drawer, and disappeared on a Tuesday morning while Jo was asleep. He left no letter, no explanation, nothing but 3 months of overdue rent notices and a bruise on her cheekbone that hadn't yet faded. Jo returned to the valley with her belly already round, one suitcase in her hand, stood at Dot's door, and cried for the first time since her mother left 14 years earlier. Dot didn't ask a single question. She opened the door, pulled Jo inside, laid a hand on her belly, and said, "This child will be strong," because her mother survived. Willa was born on a November night. Dot delivered her right there in the house because the snow was too heavy to drive anywhere, and the baby's first cry echoed through the valley as if she wanted the whole world to know she had arrived. Dot taught Willa everything she knew, starting before the child could walk, carrying her into the garden, placing leaves into tiny palms, naming each one in a voice soft as a lullaby. Then Dot died. Willa was 7 when Dot fell in the garden on an autumn afternoon, still holding a sprig of lavender, eyes turned toward the sky, and by the time Jo ran outside, she was already gone, gentle and quiet the same way she had lived. Jo buried her on the hill behind the house, stood by the grave with Willa in her arms, and understood that she truly had no one left in the world except the 7-year-old girl asking why great-grandma wouldn't wake up anymore. 2 years later, with the money gone and Appalachian winters showing no mercy to those without heat, Jo heard from an acquaintance that the Caruso estate in Connecticut needed a night housekeeper, room and board included, a place where a small child was allowed. Jo didn't know who the Carusos were. She didn't ask. She only knew there would be a roof and food for Willa, and for a mother who had lost everything, that was enough to say yes. She took Willa onto a Greyhound bus with 1 suitcase and $42 in her pocket. And during the 11-hour ride, she repeated the same sentence to her daughter that she would whisper every night for the past year. "We're blessed, sweetheart. Never forget that." The Caruso estate stretched across 40 acres of rolling land in the northern hills of Greenwich, Connecticut. And the first time Jo saw it through the window of a Greyhound bus, she thought she must be looking at a photograph torn from a magazine. Wrought iron gates rose higher than 4 meters, bearing the Caruso family crest cast in bronze. A stone-paved drive curved through 2 perfectly trimmed rows of red maples cut leaf by leaf with obsessive care. Gardens designed by a landscape architect whose work had graced the covers of 3 architecture magazines. An Italian imported fountain, with marble angels pouring water day and night, even though no one ever stood to admire it. A swimming pool shaped like the family crest. Tennis courts, a helicopter landing pad, and a 12-car garage holding vehicles worth 100 times more than the crooked wooden house where Jo had grown up. A wine cellar lay beneath the east wing of the mansion, temperature-controlled year-round, storing bottles older than Dot would have been if she were still alive. Jo took it all in on her first day and thought she had arrived on another planet. A planet where people spent more on fountains than she would earn in an entire lifetime. But it took a few weeks before Jo began to understand that the Caruso estate wasn't only about money. There were things not written into any employment contract. a soundproof meeting room in the basement that no housekeeper was allowed to approach, a concrete tunnel leading from beneath the garage toward the shoreline, which Joe glimpsed once and never again because it was hidden behind a rotating wine cabinet, more security cameras than windows, and men in dark suits, guns tucked beneath their arms, patrolling 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, faces set as if they'd forgotten how to smile a long time ago. Joe didn't ask questions. Joe never asked anything, because asking meant curiosity, and curiosity meant existing, and existing meant being noticed, and being noticed in a place like this wasn't a good thing. But she listened. The house staff talked in the kitchen when they thought no one was paying attention, and from those whispered fragments, Joe pieced together the portrait of the man she worked for, but had never met. Emilio Caruso, 36 years old, the only son of Giovanni Caruso, a boss who had built an empire from a small pharmacy in Brooklyn 50 years earlier, and turned it into a web of pharmaceutical patents, coastal real estate, and a kind of power that flowed beneath the surface of legitimacy, like groundwater beneath stone. Giovanni died of cancer 8 years earlier, and Emilio inherited everything at 28, becoming the youngest boss in the history of the 5 major families on the East Coast, and according to the head chef whispering to the butler late one night, the most ruthless of them all, not because he enjoyed violence, but because he felt nothing when he used it. They said Emilio Caruso could order a man killed and sit down to dinner without changing the rhythm of his chewing. They said he never raised his voice because he didn't need to, that the quieter he spoke, the more afraid people should be. They said he could read others the way one reads a book, knowing who was lying before they reached their second sentence. And they spoke of Celeste, his wife, the only woman who could make Emilio Caruso smile without anyone having to pay for that smile. Celeste Montoya, the daughter of a university professor, not from the mafia world, not from any world Emilio knew, and perhaps that was exactly why he loved her the way a man who had lived in darkness loves the light, desperately and greedily, and knowing he didn't deserve it but couldn't let go. Celeste was pregnant with Nico, and everyone in the estate said it was the first time they had ever seen Emilio happy, truly happy, the kind of happiness that made a killer walk more softly down the halls and ask the cook what a pregnant woman should eat for the baby's health. Then, 8 months earlier, on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 95 at 11 o'clock at night, Celeste's car was forced into the median by an unmarked black SUV at a speed of 120 kilometers per hour. The police called it an accident. Emilio called it a murder he hadn't yet avenged. Celeste bled to death in the driver's seat, but when the ambulance arrived, her heart kept beating for a few minutes on machines, long enough for surgeons to cut Nico from her womb right there in the back of the emergency vehicle, the baby crying his first cry as his mother took her last breath. From that night on, according to the butler's trembling whispers, Emilio Caruso never smiled again. He didn't cry at the funeral. He didn't cry when he held Nico for the first time. He didn't cry when he stood before Celeste's grave. Every Sunday, with a bouquet of white flowers, he placed himself, standing there for 15 minutes before turning away without a word. His emotions froze completely, as if the human part of Emilio had died alongside Celeste on that rain-soaked highway, leaving behind only a machine, cold, precise, and more dangerous than ever, because a man with nothing left to lose has nothing left to fear. Only one thing kept him from the edge of that abyss: Nico, his 8-month-old son, lying in a gold-trimmed nursery, guarded around the clock, cared for by rotating teams of nurses, watched by Emilio through security cameras every night before he sat at his desk until morning. Joe knew all of this without anyone ever telling her directly. She listened and assembled and understood, and she kept it all to herself, because that was how she survived. The way she had always survived, by knowing more than people thought she knew, and saying less than they thought she could say. Willa first noticed Nico on a September morning, 3 months before everything collapsed. She was walking to the school bus stop along the path behind the estate, the one her mother had told her to use because it stayed far from the main areas where the Caruso family lived, when she caught a glimpse through the second-floor nursery window of a nurse lifting a tiny baby into the early morning sunlight. Nico. She only knew his name from the fragments her mother let slip when she was too tired to guard her words, that the baby had lost his mother at birth, that Mr. Caruso employed an entire team of nurses, rotating in 8-hour shifts, that a nutrition specialist had been flown in from Switzerland just to advise on which formula came closest to breast milk. Willa stopped for about 10 seconds, long enough to see the baby raise a small hand to touch the ray of sunlight cutting through the glass. Then she lowered her head and kept walking, because lingering was a risk, and risk was a luxury a night housekeeper's daughter wasn't allowed to have. But the next morning she slowed her steps a little when she passed that window, and the morning after that, and the one after that, until stopping for 30 seconds each morning to watch Nico greet the sun became part of her routine, as natural as tying her shoes or counting her steps from the house to the bus stop, 422, if she walked normally, 380, if she hurried. She counted, because counting was how she controlled a world where she controlled nothing else. She didn't understand why she felt drawn to that baby. Nico had everything she didn't: a lineage, an empire, a room larger than the entire house she shared with her mother, and a team of people ready to die to protect him. But there were mornings when she saw Nico lying alone in his crib, eyes open, not crying, staring up at the gold leaf ceiling with a look an 8-month-old baby shouldn't have, the look of waiting for a familiar hand that would never come again, because that hand had gone cold on Interstate 95, 8 months earlier. And Willa understood. She understood in the way only children without mothers can understand children who have lost theirs. She understood that Nico lay inside a golden cage while she stood outside the fence. But both of them were looking out through their own windows at a world they didn't belong to. Nico would grow up with the Caruso name on his shoulders, with an empire and enemies, and walls of bodyguards separating him from everything ordinary. Willa would grow up in the shadows, skirting walls, learning how not to make noise, learning how to exist without leaving traces. 2 children, 2 prisons, 2 sentences written long before they could read, on the same 40-acre estate, where the distance between the gold-trimmed nursery and the servants' quarters was only 200 meters, yet farther than any ocean. On some afternoons after school, Willa would sneak around the eastern gardens just to watch the nanny push Nico's stroller, and she found herself smiling when Nico reached out to grab a leaf, worrying when he coughed softly in the autumn wind, whispering the words Dot once said, "Every child comes into this world pure, sweetheart. What happens after that is on us adults." Willa didn't know that the invisible thread tying her to the baby in the golden cage would soon pull her straight into the eye of the storm. She didn't know that 3 months of silent watching, 3 months of counting steps and stopping for 30 seconds each morning, would be the thing that saved Nico Caruso's life. She only knew that she was an invisible 10-year-old girl, and Nico was an 8-month-old baby without a mother. And sometimes that was enough for 2 people to belong to each other without anyone's permission. Then came that Tuesday afternoon, and everything changed. The servants' side door in the west wing of the mansion stayed unlocked for about 4 minutes each day, precisely when the afternoon shift changed to the night shift at 3 o'clock. And Willa knew this because she had counted, watched, and carved it into her memory through hundreds of passes over the past year, living at the edge of this estate. She had never used that knowledge until now. Her shoes touched the marble floor of the servants' corridor, and the first sound she heard was her own heart, beating so fast she thought someone was knocking from inside her chest, trying to get out. The corridor was long and narrow, whitewashed walls without decoration, fluorescent lights instead of chandeliers. This was the backside of the Caruso estate, the side guests never saw, the side meant for people like her mother, people who existed to serve and then disappear before anyone had to remember they were there. Willa ran. Her worn shoes slapped against the marble, each step echoing through the empty corridor. And she knew the sound of her footsteps was breaking every rule her mother had taught her, that she was making noise, taking up space, existing loudly for the first time in her life. And each step carried her closer to either disaster or salvation, and she didn't know which. Left at the corridor junction, past the laundry room, past the linen storage, to the service staircase leading up to the second floor. She had mapped this route in her head hundreds of times while skirting walls, while pretending to fetch things for her mother, while counting steps and doors and cameras, because counting was the only way she ever felt any power in a place where she had none. 17 steps, turn right, the second floor corridor, and now she could hear it. The noise, the machines, the shouted orders, the chaos bleeding through the heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, the door to the nursery, where Nico was dying and 24 doctors were losing a battle they didn't understand why they were losing. Willa ran to the door, and 2 walls of flesh stopped her. 2 guards, each at least 5 times her weight. Black suits, earpieces, cold eyes, hands as wide as her face planted against her chest like stopping a stray cat in the wrong place. Willa didn't stop. She screamed. Her 10-year-old voice shattered down the corridor like breaking glass. The plant on the windowsill is killing the baby. The guards looked at each other, looked at her, looked at each other again. One of them said flatly, without emotion, "Get out. Restricted area." Willa didn't get out. She tried to slip through the gap between them, reached for the door, because she knew behind that door was the oleander, and behind the oleander was the answer, and behind the answer was the life of an 8-month-old baby she had watched in secret every morning for 3 months. She screamed again, louder this time, her voice tearing with desperation. "Oleander. It's oleander. You have to listen to me." One guard grabbed her by the collar of her jacket, her mother's oversized jacket, and lifted her off the ground like a kitten by the scruff of the neck. Willa's legs kicked in the air. Her hands still reached for the door. She didn't cry. She didn't cry because Dot had taught her that tears were a luxury for people with time. And right now she had no time, because every second passing was a second Nico moved closer to death. She kept shouting, her voice hoarse now but not weaker. "That plant is poison." The sap got on the gardener's gloves. The gloves touched the baby's crib. "You have to take the plant out of the room." Then heavy footsteps thundered from the far end of the corridor, and Willa turned her head and saw Paxton Webb approaching, head of security for the Caruso estate, a former mercenary, a man with a neck as thick as a tree trunk and the eyes of someone who had seen enough to be surprised by nothing. Except right now his eyes were narrowing because he was surprised, because what he saw was a scrawny 10-year-old girl dangling by her collar, screaming about plants like a mad child in the most heavily guarded corridor on the east coast of the United States. Paxton stopped in front of Willa, looked down at her from his full height, and his voice was cold as steel. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Willa didn't get the chance to answer Paxton because the nursery door burst open and the person who stepped out wasn't a doctor or a nurse, but Emilio Caruso. She had never seen the Caruso boss from this close. Never closer than 100 meters. Never anywhere except on the other side of glass, or the other side of a fence, or the other side of the class chasm separating her world from his. But now he was standing right there, less than 2 steps away, and the first thing Willa noticed wasn't wealth or power or the fear everyone talked about, but his eyes. Dark eyes, deep and empty in the way only people who have lost too much can be empty. Yet beneath that emptiness, Willa saw something she recognized instantly, because she had seen it in her mother's eyes every night for 10 years. The fear of losing the only thing left. Emilio looked at the girl dangling by her jacket collar, at the worn heels of her shoes, at the coat 3 sizes too big for her thin body, at eyes red but dry because this child wasn't crying, and he said 2 words to Paxton in a flat voice. The kind people said was most dangerous when it stayed level. "Let her go." Paxton signaled the guards and Willa's feet touched the floor. She swayed for a second, coat askew, hair falling loose, but she didn't step back, didn't lower her head, didn't look down. She looked straight into Emilio Caruso's eyes, and at 10 years old, the daughter of a night housekeeper, standing before the most feared mafia boss on the east coast of the United States, Willa Mercer spoke. Her voice shook, but each word was clear. The voice of a child trying to cram the knowledge of 4 generations of women into the shortest sentences possible, because she didn't know how many seconds she had before being dragged away. She said, "The plant on the nursery windowsill. It's oleander. Every part of it is poisonous. Someone brought it in 3 days ago. Yesterday the gardener pruned it wearing gloves, and then used those same gloves to wipe the crib rail. The sap got on the rail. The baby touched the rail and then put his hand in his mouth. That's how the poison entered his body. Oleandrin. It causes heart rhythm disturbances, cyanosis, rashes. If it isn't treated correctly, the baby will die." Silence followed. The kind of silence where Willa could hear the ventilator behind the door, and her own heartbeat, and Paxton's heavy breathing behind her like a wall ready to fall at any moment. Then laughter. Not from Emilio, but from inside the nursery, where Dr. Whitfield, the Caruso family's private physician, had stepped out and heard everything, and was now laughing. The sharp, dismissive laugh of a man with a medical doctorate from Johns Hopkins and 30 years of experience being told by a 10-year-old girl wearing her mother's coat that he and 23 colleagues were wrong. Dr. Whitfield spoke, polite in tone but with contempt dripping from every syllable. "Mr. Caruso, this is clearly a frightened child saying nonsensical things. Oleander causes poisoning through direct ingestion, not indirect contact like this. We've run all standard toxicology panels and there's no indication of oleander glycosides. I suggest we don't waste any more time." Willa felt her face burn, but she didn't retreat. she said, quieter now but steady. My great-grandmother said oleandrin doesn't show up on standard toxicology screens. It has to be tested for, specifically. You only find it if you know what you're looking for. Dr. Whitfield opened his mouth to continue, but Emilio raised one hand, and the doctor fell silent as if someone had pulled a plug. Emilio looked at Willa, looked for a long time, in a way she had never been looked at in her life. Not glanced over, not looked through, but seen directly, as if he were reading her, weighing every word she had said, searching for any sign of lying or delusion, or anything that would allow him to dismiss her and return to the room where 24 doctors were still failing. He didn't find it. What he found in Willa Mercer's eyes was certainty. The quiet kind no degree teaches. The kind passed down through hands that smelled faintly of lavender, belonging to a woman who had healed half the poorest valley in Appalachia with herbs and faith alone. Emilio turned to Dr. Whitfield, and the doctor saw something in the boss's gaze that made him swallow. Emilio spoke 4 words, flat and leaving no room for argument. Run an oleandrin test. Now. Footsteps came running from the far end of the corridor before Emilio could turn back into the nursery. Not the footsteps of guards or doctors or anyone who belonged on this level of the estate, but the sound of a woman in thin house slippers slapping against marble, the uneven rhythm tangled with ragged breathing, and a sound like the low moan of a wounded animal. Jolene Mercer burst from the service staircase, hair flying loose, her night shift apron still tied around her because she hadn't had time to remove it, when another housekeeper told her that her daughter had broken into a restricted area, that the girl was shouting in front of Mr. Caruso, that Paxton Webb was there, and everyone knew that Paxton Webb's presence meant nothing was small. Jo ran, and the first thing she saw was Willa, her daughter, the only child she had left in the world, standing in the middle of the corridor before a man feared across the entire East Coast, coat hanging crooked, eyes red, posture of a child who had just risked her life without yet knowing how much her life was worth in this world. Jo didn't think. Her body moved before her mind could catch up. The instinct of a mother long used to shielding her child with her own flesh because she had nothing else to shield with. Jo lunged forward, dropped to her knees on the marble floor right in front of Emilio, pulled Willa behind her, wrapped both arms around her daughter and used her own body as a barrier between the child and the boss. And she spoke. "No," she begged, her voice breaking into uneven pieces. Please spare her. She's just a child. She doesn't know anything. I'll pack our things immediately. We'll leave tonight. Please don't hurt my child." Jo's knees hit the cold stone and she felt no pain, because the fear inside her was larger than any pain Bryce Mercer had ever caused. Larger than any Appalachian winter without heat. Larger than anything she had endured, because this wasn't about her. This was about Willa. And a mother afraid for her child knows no limits to that fear. Willa hid behind her mother's back, and for the first time since she had run into the mansion, her eyes began to fill, not because she feared for herself, but because she saw her mother kneeling, her mother begging, her mother in a position no woman should ever have to take, and she knew she was the one who had pushed her mother there. Emilio stood and watched. For the past year, this woman had worked in his house, mopping the floors he walked on, washing the sheets he slept in, cleaning the dishes he ate from, and he had never known she existed. For 3 years she had moved like smoke through his estate, invisible enough that even the security cameras Paxton checked every day barely caught her shadow. Not because she intended anything, but because the survival instincts of someone used to being hit had taught her that not being seen meant not being hurt. But now Emilio saw her. For the first time, and what he saw wasn't a night housekeeper, not a name on a payroll he had never read, but a mother kneeling on cold stone, shielding her child with her body, willing to accept any punishment, willing to be thrown out into the night, willing to lose everything as long as the child behind her wasn't touched. And something shifted inside Emilio. Not emotion. He had forgotten what emotion was the night Celeste died on Interstate 95, but it was something. A crack, small, thin as a hairline, in the wall of ice he had built around himself for 8 months. The crack began with the image of a woman kneeling at his feet, not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to make herself small to protect what mattered most. And Emilio recognized it because he was doing the same thing, standing in a room full of doctors feeling more powerless than ever, because his son was dying, and all the power in the world couldn't buy an answer. He looked down at Jo, looked at her hands gripping Willa so tightly her knuckles were white, looked at the faint old bruises on her wrist, that he recognized instantly, because he had seen enough wounds in his life to know the mark of another person's hand, and Emilio spoke. His voice stayed level, stayed cold, stayed the voice of Caruso that the city feared. But Joe heard something beneath the ice, something she didn't dare name because naming it meant believing in it.